Fantastic event. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity to stand before you this afternoon and to talk about something that I think is really important. Now, the good news is that the pressure's off me this afternoon because a couple of things. First of all, I've never used PowerPoint before to preach. And so, Brother Jerry, I feel your pain. If this goes horribly wrong, I've got an excuse. You should know that. We'll all make history together here. But the other reason pressure's off of me today is because you've already been edified greatly this morning. We have heard fantastic sermons from the speakers so far. We have heard powerful evidence about fundamental tenets of our faith. We have heard about the concept of truth. We have heard about the existence of God. We have heard about the reliability of the Scriptures, God's magnificent creation, and the accuracy of the Bible's portrayal of Jesus. And in a world where our faith is under persistent attack just every day, it is so important that we take some time to remind ourselves that our faith is not some unsupported leap into the hereafter, but instead it's one that is based on logic, reason, and a host of other evidence. That's important. This afternoon, though, I want to talk with you about whether any of this really matters. Now, I've already told Brother Mike that I promised I wasn't just going to say no and sit down because I didn't want to undermine his whole lesson. But it does. Obviously, this matters. And I want to talk with you a little bit about that. Now, that may seem like a kind of an odd question to us today because we're at a brotherhood meeting. I mean, of course it matters to us. I mean, you spent a lot of money and time to be here because you believe that Christianity makes a difference in your life. We believe that Christianity makes a difference because we believe it has the power to change our lives and the lives of our family, the lives of our congregations, and the lives of individuals around us. In John chapter 14 and in verse number 6, the Bible says, Jesus saith unto them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man come to the Father but by me. Brother Michael talked about that. We believe that Christianity makes a difference in our life. But I want to ask a different question this afternoon. It's not whether you believe or I believe that Christianity makes a difference. We do. The question this afternoon is whether it's made a difference to the world at large. And you know, that's a fair question to ask. If the Bible and if Christianity is as impactful as we say it is, if Christianity is as life-changing as we say it is, then we ought to be able to look at the world around us and discern impacts that Christianity has made, real changes in the world. And if we can't, we ought to ask why that is. And maybe that's a reason to question some things. Now, the good news is that there is an immense mountain of evidence about how Christianity has changed this world. The better news is that I'm not going to cover all that this afternoon, or else we'd be here for a long, long time. I've got a little bit of time, and I want to spend that with you talking about a few of these things. Now, many in the world don't believe Christianity's made very much of a positive difference. This is a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. He is a German philosopher, and he says, I condemn Christianity. I bring against the Christian church the most terrible of all the accusations that an accuser has ever had in his mouth. It is to me the greatest of all imaginable corruptions. It seeks to work the ultimate corruption, the worst possible corruption. The Christian church has left nothing untouched by its depravity. It has turned every value into worthlessness, and every truth into a lie, and every integrity into baseness of soul. That's a pretty stinging indictment. And, you know, we can read philosopher upon philosopher, really, that have had very similar things to say about Christianity. But I want you to know it's not just philosophers that have lived in some faraway country maybe centuries ago that have this view. We have it in our popular culture. Those of you who are a little older may remember John Lennon in a song that he used to sing called Imagine. Part of that song said, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. You know what John Lennon was saying in that song? Imagine a world without religion. How great would that be? That was really the message of the song. And there are lots of individuals who believe Christianity has oppressed people. It's led to all kinds of problems in this world. And folks, we can let those charges just go unanswered. We can say, you know what? We know Christ made a difference. And we don't care what they say. But let me tell you something, just like, I can't remember who said it, if you say a lie and tell a lie big enough, people will begin to believe it. Let me tell you something, if we leave these charges unanswered as Christians, people are going to believe it and begin to follow it. We have to be able to answer them. And we have got plenty of ways to do it. Now, you don't have to go very far in the historical record to understand that Christianity made some sort of impact. In the book of Acts, chapter 17 and verse number 6, it says there, "And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also, whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus." Apparently, the early Christians made quite an impact, because the Bible says that the charge against them was that they were turning the world upside down. They were creating havoc in the community at large because of some of the teachings that they were espousing and some of the things that they were telling individuals. Christianity certainly had an impact. And I guess the question for us this afternoon is, did it have a good one or has it had a bad one? Is Nietzsche right? Is it just awful and depravity? Or are we right? And Christianity is a power for good and a life-changing force in this world. Well, I want to visit with you about some impacts of Christianity. Like I said, we could talk about a lot. I want to just talk about 4 with you this afternoon. I'm going to keep saying morning. I'm trying to roll the clock back because I need more time. So just hold on. Number 1, the sanctity of human life. I want to talk a little bit about that with you. Number 2, sexual moral standards. Number 3, improvement of the status of women. And number 4, fundamental concepts of justice and rights. Now, there's a lot of other things. We could talk about economic systems. We could talk about education. We could talk about charity, and the list goes on and on and on. These are just a few of the things that I wanted to visit with you about. Now, before we begin, let me tell you that some of these concepts, you can just look at the list, some of these things are not going to be pretty things to talk about. And I understand that. And I want you to know that I know we've got an audience that's a little mixed here this afternoon. I'm going to try and deal with these things as diplomatically as I can. But we also have to be real about what the world was like prior to Christianity in order to understand how impactful Christianity was. And so it's important that we cover these concepts, and I'll try and do that in as graceful a manner as I can. So first, the sanctity of human life. Christianity was born into a world where the sanctity of human life just really didn't exist. Life was cheap. People did not respect life in any shape, way, or form like we respect it today. Even in a world that seems to have gone haywire, we have a respect for the sanctity of life that exceeds far the world that Christianity was born into. And I want to talk about a couple of examples of what I mean. In the Greco-Roman world that Christianity was born into, there was a practice called infanticide. Now, infanticide is the killing of babies, of infants. Now, I'm not talking about abortion. I'm talking about babies that have been born, that are outside of the womb, that are living, that are crying, that are laughing. I'm talking about killing those babies. That was a practice, and it was a prevalent practice in the Greco-Roman world. Cicero, who was a philosopher at the time, said, "Deformed infants shall be killed." Seneca said, "We drown children who at birth are weakly and abnormal." And Polybius, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I'm sure somebody will correct me afterwards. Brad, my brother, will probably be the first one to do it. Polybius cited infanticide as a major reason for the population decline that had occurred in Greece. It was so prevalent that the reason that the population had declined, Polybius said, was because of infanticide. It was a brutal, brutal practice. Now, what made infanticide perhaps even more brutal than just the concept itself was the way that it was carried out in the Greco-Roman world. You see, baby girls were a particular target of infanticide because men were strong, they could go into the field, they could fight battles. You wanted men, but women, that was a different deal. They just kind of consumed resources, it was thought. And so you didn't want too many of those. As a matter of fact, there's an inscription at Delphi that records a list of families. Only 1% of the families recorded on that inscription, and there were hundreds of families recorded, only 1% of those families had more than one daughter. Now, John Lennon wanted you to imagine a world without religion. I want you to look around the room today and think about all the young women we have here. I think Brother Jerry said he had 8 or 9 grandchildren, granddaughters. You know, they probably wouldn't exist in the Roman Greco world before Christianity. We wouldn't have many of these young women around us. They would have been killed. And when you think about that and you think about the world that Christianity came into, it's important, like I said, I know these are not comfortable topics, but it's important for us to understand what kind of world we were talking about. You know, the Bible, whenever Christianity began and the Christians began to teach, they began to teach principles like we find in Romans chapter 21 and verse 8, that murder was wrong. You see, the Bible didn't equivocate. It didn't say, you know, there were certain times whenever, you know, if you've got a weakly kid or, you know, if we've got too much population, it's okay to commit murder, to kill a couple of babies. The Bible changed that. It revolutionized the ideas behind the sanctity of life because the Bible simply said murder is wrong. All murderers, along with all these other sins that we read here, will have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. There was no gray area. There was no situational ethics. There was no rationalization of murder. The Bible just simply said it was wrong. And that respect for the sanctity of life that the church began to preach and teach made a tremendous difference in the world. In Matthew chapter 18 and verse number 6, Jesus talks about how children, especially children, are precious. When he said, "But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged around his neck and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea." Now, as I said, whenever those teachings began to be given to the Christians, the early Christians began to teach this message. There's an early writing called the Didache. It was written around 85 or 110 AD, somewhere in that time period. It's not inspired, but it is a record of early Christian beliefs. And in this document it says, "Thou shalt not commit infanticide." Now, the fact that it mentions infanticide ought to tell you something, that ought to tell you something about the practice, and that it was pervasive enough that the church had to speak out against it. But notice what the Didache says. It doesn't say, hey, sometimes or in right circumstances. It simply says, it shall not be done. And that kind of moral clarity that was brought to the sanctity of life debate had been missing from the world. Justin Martyr's first apology, he's making an apology or a defense, and he says, "We have been taught that it is wicked to expose even newly born Christians." You see, the way infanticide was often carried out, and it's terrible to think about, is that they would take a baby that they didn't want anymore. And the way that they would kill that baby is, I guess, maybe one of the most cruel things I could think about. They would take the baby and they would just leave it in the elements, in the heat, in the rain, whatever it was, and they would just leave it there until it died. The kid died of exposure. And here Justin Martyr says, "We have been taught that it is wicked to expose even newly born children." Athenagoras, who was making a plea to Marcus Aurelius. Now, I'm not telling you all of these gentlemen followed Christianity to the very letter. I don't know about their personal lives, but these are folks that historically we have as early Christians that have written down what at least the practices and the teachings were at that time. And Athenagoras says, "We do not expose an infant because those who expose them are chargeable with child murder." See, the Bible was very clear, and early Christians were very clear about this practice. And so, a few hundred years later, in 374 AD, the Roman Emperor Valentinian outlawed the practice of infanticide. Now, lest you think that I'm just kind of stringing together dates and kind of making up whether the Christianity had such an impact, there is a Norwegian scholar named Bakke, and he wrote a book saying, "When Children Became People, the Birth of Childhood in Early Christianity." You see, the respect of life, especially among kid lives, infant lives, was so low that researchers call that really, when Christianity came, the birth of childhood. When children became people. And that was brought about because the church stood up and said, killing babies is wrong. All murder is wrong. The sanctity of life should be respected, full stop. And that moral clarity changed the world. There was another practice, a practice we are familiar with more today, the practice of abortion. Abortion was prevalently practiced at the time. I know it's practiced today, but it was really practiced in a very higher degree in the Greco-Roman world that Christianity was born into. Plato argued that the state could compel a woman to submit to abortion as a population control measure. Now, nobody would ever think of that, even today in the world that we live in, that it would be a state that could impose somebody to commit an abortion. At least in our country, we wouldn't think of that. But Plato argued that that was a proper prerogative of the state. Aristotle, who we've heard about today, stated that there was a limit fixed to the procreation of offspring, and where exceeded, abortion must be practiced. Not just an option. We're not talking about, pro-life and pro-choice. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about where the state can come and say, you shall have an abortion. That occurred in the world before Christianity. Seneca talks about a practice, and I'll read the quote here in a minute, but let me tell you the background for this. There was a practice that had developed in the world at that time, and it had to do with families that were childless. Families that were childless had, at some point, were going to have to leave their belongings. And whenever it came time to leave their belongings, it became a practice. If you could find a family that was childless, well, people would begin to cozy up to them. They would kowtow to them. They'd try and persuade them to put them in the will. And so Seneca here talks about this practice, is what he's talking about. And he says, childlessness bestows more influence than it takes away. And the loneliness that used to be a detriment to old age now leads to so much power that some old men pretend to hate their sons and disown their children, and by their act make themselves childless. You see, abortion was not just a practice that was committed because the state said so. It was also done for profit, for power. And what a terrible, terrible situation that was. The scriptures, again, were clear on abortion. We've already talked about murder being wrong. 1 John 3:15 says, no murderer shall have eternal life abiding in him. And Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse number 5 makes it clear that whenever we're talking about life within a womb, we're talking about life. He says, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee as a prophet unto the nations. Apparently, what's in the womb is something that God could know, something that God could sanctify, and something that God could ordain. And that's because it's a life. And the Bible taught that, and Christians taught that. Athenagoras, again, in about 177 AD, he's answering a charge here about cannibalism. The church was charged with being cannibals. That was because of a misunderstanding of the Lord's Supper. People who heard the practice of the church misunderstood whenever the Christians said that they were partaking of the body and the blood of Jesus. And they charged the church with being cannibals. And Athenagoras, in answering that charge, says, what reason would we have to commit murder when we say that women who induce abortions are murderesses? The church's position was clear on this point. Moral clarity had been brought to life because of Christianity. And Tertullian, who was an author, the Christian author that lived in Carthage, said, we may not destroy even the fetus in the womb, nor does it matter whether you take away the life that is born or destroy one that is coming to birth. Christianity taught with moral clarity about the issue of abortion. And in 374 AD, Valentinian, when he outlawed infanticide, also outlawed abortion, because of the teachings of the church and because of the effect that those teachings had in the community at large by that time. Now, there are other affronts to the sanctity of life that existed. We could talk about human sacrifices. We could talk about Baal and Moloch and Celtic tribes, the Aztecs and the Mayans. All of these civilizations practiced human sacrifice. And you know what? They all stopped doing it when they came into contact with Christianity. That's when those practices stopped. Now, John Lennon may want to imagine a world without Christianity, but I don't. And I think if you look around this room and you think about all the kids we have here, you don't want to imagine that either. The gladiator contest that pitted man against man against beast, were something that we're talking about a society that would pay money and get entertainment out of watching murder. We would never even imagine that today. But yet, that's what happened back in the time of the Roman Empire. That practice came to an end. We have suicide, which was glorified in the Greco-Roman world. It was an honorable way to die. And again, Christianity spoke out about the detriment and the spiritual problems associated with suicide, that it was a sin. So again, a lot of things we could talk about, but that's one way that Christianity has impacted the world. Now I want to talk with you a little bit about sexual moral standards. Sexuality in the pagan world was much different. In some ways, I guess it was the same, but we're talking about a category of degrees here, and it was really something that is hard for us to imagine, and I'm not sure what I just did there. There it is. We had sexual relationships outside of marriage. I know we have that today, but it was a very, very common thing back in the Greco-Roman world. Pedophilia, something that we abhor, everyone abhors today, was something that was common. Emperors practiced pedophilia back in the time. We had other things like homosexuality, which was celebrated and practiced again at the very highest levels of government. Public displays of sexual conduct. Christy and I had an opportunity to go to Pompeii and walk through Pompeii, and we walked into a room that was very uncomfortable. We had to get out. It was a room that was painted with frescoes, and it was nothing but this. Nothing but this. Many of you would have run out screaming when you saw what was on that wall. And yet that was art. I mean, you brought your friends over. You had dinner in rooms like that. That was the society that we're talking about here. It was a very, very terrible, terrible thing. And bestiality is another common example, commonly practiced thing back then, and we don't want to get into that very much. But Christianity revolutionized sexuality. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse number 4 said, marriage is honorable in all and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. Christianity said, look, enough of these sexual perversions and the free attitude about this topic. The Bible began to speak very clearly and said, you know what? Marriage is honorable and the bed is undefiled. And if we violate that, God will judge us for it. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse number 4 through 6, it says, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. That was revolutionary. It was absolutely revolutionary. It was common. As a matter of fact, it was a man's right back in the Greco-Roman world to commit adultery. And the woman couldn't do anything about it. The women had no right to divorce the man. And so it was a very, very common practice. Galen at the time said, Christians are so far advanced in self-discipline and intense desire to attain moral excellence that they are in no way inferior to true philosophers. Even non-Christians who wrote at this time credit Christianity with changing sexual mores at the time. And the third way that Christianity's impacted the world is the status of women in society. Now I got to tell you, this one is the one that is the hardest for me to stomach. Somebody mentioned earlier this morning about, the Church of Christ hates women. And we hear that about the Church of Christ. We hear about that Christianity at large. And I've got a few quotes to show you about this that may cause you to be a little upset, but I think it's important. It ought to cause you to be upset, but I think it's important to understand sometimes the attitude that the world at large has about Christianity. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is a very famous feminist, and she said, the church is a terrible engine of oppression, especially as concerns women. Naomi Goldenberg, in her book, Changing of the Gods, listen to this quote, God is going to change. We women will change the world so much that he won't fit it anymore. Gloria Steinem, I'm sure a lot of you have heard her, said, by the year 2000, we will, I hope, raise our children to believe in human potential, not God. Now, I'm glad to say that her prediction is not true for any of you in this room, and that's fantastic. But I'm sorry to say that I think she may have been right about others in society. We face a society where sometimes that is taught. Anne Laurie Gaylor said, let's not, now this is the quote that really every time I read it, I really have to catch myself. Let's forget about the mythical Jesus and look for encouragement, solace, and inspiration from real women. 2,000 years of patriarchal rule under the shadow of the cross ought to be enough to turn women against or toward the feminist salvation of the world. I mean, what a statement. What a blasphemous, wrong, immoral statement to make. But yet that's what feminists sometimes will charge against God's church. But you know what's interesting about that is it's just wrong. It is just absolutely wrong as a matter of historical fact. Here's a quote from an author writing at the time, Bill Kelly, writing about what the world was like when Christianity came into it. I want you to listen to this quote. It was extremely common in the Greco-Roman world to throw out new female infants to die from exposure. We've talked about that because of the low status of women in society. The church forbade its members to do so. Greco-Roman society saw no value in an unmarried woman, and therefore it was illegal for a widow to go more than 2 years without remarrying. But Christianity was the first religion to not force widows to remarry. They were supported financially and honored within the community so that they were not under great pressure to remarry if they didn't want to. Pagan widows lost all control of their husband's estate when they remarried, but the church allowed widows to maintain their husband's estate. Finally, Christians did not believe in cohabitation. If a Christian man wanted to live with a woman, he had to marry her, and this gave women a far greater security. Also, the pagan double standard of allowing married women to have extramarital sex and mistresses was, for a married man to have extramarital sex and mistresses was forbidden. In all these ways, Christian women enjoyed far greater security and equality than did women in the surrounding culture. You see, point by point, when we look at the status of women in the Greco-Roman world, and then we look at what Christianity did, in every point that we looked at, their status improved. This idea that the church is an engine of oppression is just simply contradicted flat out by the historical record. Now, Greek women at the time had the social status of a slave. They had to have male escorts to leave the house. They had no dinner with their husband. If the husband had friends over, they couldn't have dinner with them. They could not obtain a divorce. Now, I'm not here to tell you that we should, have a party because a woman could give a divorce or get a divorce. But the point here is that no matter how bad, no matter what the situation was, women couldn't have one, and a man could. And that was a signal of the status of women in society at the time. And they were, as we've talked about, the preferred targets of infanticide. Roman women had the Roman law of manus. The Roman law of manus said that a man controlled the woman and all of her possessions. So a man could tell a woman what to do. Not only could he tell a woman what to do, but he also controlled everything that was physically hers. It belonged to the man, and he had complete control. Roman law also provided that a woman couldn't obtain a divorce. They could not inherit property. There was also a doctrine called patria potestas. Patria potestas said that a man had control not only of the children of a marriage, but also of the grandchildren. Now, how would that go over today? I bet you there's a lot of women and grandmothers that would not live with this particular law. But that was the law back in the Greco-Roman time, is that a man had control of the kids, could tell them what to do and order their life, and also had authority over the grandchildren as well. And they were abused sexually in pagan worship. Women were abused and taken advantage of and relegated to a very low status in society before Christianity came. Now, Christianity came, and in Galatians 3:28, here's what Christianity taught. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That was shocking to the world. It was absolutely shocking. That was never taught before in any kind of forceful way. Here was a bunch of Christians saying, you know what, there's no difference between man and woman. And the Greeks and the Romans are saying, are you kidding me? Have you not seen our society? Have you not heard about the law of manus and the law of patria potestas? I mean, men and women are just different. Christianity said, no, we're all one in Christ Jesus. And we could read example after example, Phoebe in Romans chapter 16, Priscilla in the same chapter. We could read about Lydia in Acts chapter 16, women that were honored and revered for their dedication and their work in the church. That's what Christianity brought. We talked about widows in 1 Timothy 5:3, honor the widows that are widows indeed. James 1:27 says, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. But you know, not all religions agree with that. We've had a lot about Islam, and I don't want to belabor the point this morning, but in the Quran there is a statement there, and I want you to listen to this. Allah has made men superior to women because men spend their wealth to support them. Therefore, virtuous women are obedient, and they are to guard their unseen parts as Allah has guarded them. As for women whom you fear will rebel, admonish them first, and then send them to a separate bed, and then beat them. But if they are obedient after that, then do nothing further. Surely Allah is exalted and great. Now, folks, that's the religious system that is taking over large sections of the world today. And as Christians, we cannot cede this ground to Islam. We serve a God that honors and respects women. We honor women in our churches. We don't beat them. We don't consider them objects of control. We honor them. And that made a difference at the time of the Greco-Roman world whenever Christianity came. Now, I want to tell you, I've had the opportunity to travel to the Middle East because of my job a few times, and I've been to Saudi Arabia a few times, and it's a very interesting place. When you go to Saudi Arabia, you know what you don't see if you're a foreigner? You don't see women. You just don't see them. They're not allowed to drive cars. They're not out by themselves. You just don't see them. If you see them, they are walking with their husband because that's the only way they can be out on the street, or with another brother or some family member who escorts them. And I was taught whenever I went over there, I was informed and told very specifically, do not talk to a woman, because if you talk to them, there will be a problem. It's against the law. Now, folks, that's the law in Saudi Arabia. It's the law also in other Islamic countries. I've been to some of them. I've been to Algeria, same thing. I've been to the United Arab Emirates, which is a little more liberal, and you see a few more women there, but still, women are not treated like they are here in the United States. We treat women differently, and we do that because of the impact that Christianity made on society. Finally, I want to talk about modern concepts of liberty and justice. This is another fundamental way that Christianity has impacted the world. Pre-Christian notions about government were kind of interesting. There were some people who, made some argument that, hey, we should have some governmental reform. Maybe we shouldn't have so many dictators. But yet, despots and dictators and emperors and people like that were the norm for government back at that time. And they exercised unquestionable control and meted out arbitrary punishments. I mean, for example, if an emperor didn't like you, he could have you killed. He didn't like the Christians. And so many emperors persecuted Christians, not because of any violation of the law, they just didn't like them. They were set as torches to light the street. And that was just because that was the despotic control that government had at that time. Now, the Bible has a very different view of these things. For example, the Bible brought in the law that requires 2 or more witnesses for adversarial proceedings. Gone were the days when an emperor could point somebody out and say, I don't like him, let's crucify him, or let's beat him, or let's put him in prison. The Bible began to implement this concept of we need corroborating testimony. And that exists today in our judicial system, where corroborating testimony is a key part of the evidence. And we've talked about evidence and corroborating testimony today. All of those are principles that come from God's Word. The identification of God as the source of natural law. You know, Brother Jay talked this morning about truth and the fact that we know what truth is, and there's a right and a wrong that we understand. And some people say, you know, some of that is innate, and I guess some of it is, but Christianity was the first one to source that to God. The reason we have natural law, the reason we know things are right and wrong, the reason Romans chapter 1 talks about we are without excuse is because God, it wasn't some accident of chemicals coming together, as Brother Jerry talked about. It was because God made us that way. He made us that way. And therefore the natural law that we talk about, these unalienable rights that we speak of, those things come from God. And Christianity sourced those things to God. The emphasis on individual rights and responsibilities also was a big part of the New Testament. Romans 14:12, so then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. It didn't matter what group you were a part of anymore. I mean, back in the Old Testament, you had to be Jewish. No longer. It didn't matter what group you were in. The New Testament, Christianity taught individual responsibility. It mattered what you did individually. John Locke picked up on this. He was a philosopher, and he picked up on the idea of natural law, and his political treatises sourced them to God. And John Locke's treatises and works became the foundation for a document that we know today as the Declaration of Independence. There was another writer, a man by the name of Baron de Montesquieu, who was called the godfather of the American Constitution. Now, he was in Europe, but he wrote about certain philosophies, and he wrote about Christian philosophies. He said the Christian religion is a stranger to mere despotic power. The mildness so frequently recommended in the gospel is incompatible with the despotic rage with which a prince punishes his subjects and exercises himself in cruelty. We shall see that we owe to Christianity in government a certain political law, and in war a certain law of nations, benefits which humanity can never sufficiently acknowledge. You want to know why we talk about inalienable rights? You want to know why there's individual right movements all over the world? You want to know why we talk about things like war crimes and war atrocities? Because of Christianity. Because Christianity brought to bear that kind of ethos into the world that changed the way that we viewed it. Now, there's an opposing view. Here's a quote from Hitler. We've talked about him today. The individual is nothing. The group is everything. That's what Hitler says. Don't pay attention to the individual. Worry about which group you're in. God says, I don't care which group you're in. I'll care about what you think and what you believe and what you do. That was a fundamentally different concept. Also, Christianity had a view of equality. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. You know what that did? That equalized everybody. That took the emperor and it made it the same as the poorest man in the Roman Empire, because they all had sinned and they'd all fallen short of God. That was, of course, a novel concept. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 17, it says there that God regards not persons. And in Acts chapter 10, verse 34 and 35, we read that God is not a respecter of persons. Christianity began to teach equality amongst all the people. And when we talk about equality today, and we talk about freedom, when we talk about liberty, we talk about all the things that we cherish in this country and in Western civilization, those things came because Christianity came into the world. And today we see democracies, we see a general notion of basic individual human rights, we see judicial systems that aim to protect the rights of the accused but still provide for justice, and we find the failure of other institutions like communism and socialism and dictatorships that no matter they may have some brief flourish, they always fail because they never get it right. Because God was right when he said that people have individual rights and equality and liberty. So I want to close this afternoon by asking you today, does Christianity still matter? We've talked about 4 different ways in which Christianity has changed the world, but I think we've had some insight today that tells you that the world is changing. We're losing some ground. The world is starting to turn away And we need to ask ourselves whether Christianity still makes a difference today. In today's world, with respect to the sanctity of life, since Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, 54 million abortions have been committed. I want to read that number to you again. 54 million abortions since Roe versus Wade. We have now partial birth abortions. We have actual infanticide, where babies have been killed after they've been born. We have laws about euthanasia, talking about how you should end your life on your terms. And we have war atrocities. Pick up the newspaper this morning. Read about Hamas using civilian shields, or read about Boko Haram in Nigeria and other things. The sanctity of life is starting to lose its respect. One time, the first time, I was going into Saudi Arabia. We were coming over the causeway. We had flown into Bahrain, and we had to go across the bridge over the Persian Gulf to drive into Saudi Arabia. And I had a driver because we had to have security. And so we were driving across this causeway, and we were about a mile away from the checkpoint, the customs checkpoint. And the driver pulled over. And he said, "Do you have any alcohol?" And I said, "No, I don't have any alcohol." He said, "Are you sure that you don't have any alcohol?" I said, "Yes, I'm sure I don't have any alcohol." He said, "Are you positive that you don't have any alcohol? Because if you do, you'll be killed." I wanted to go and check my bags to make sure that nobody had slipped anything in it. That'll get your attention. Folks, the sanctity of life does not mean the same thing in other parts of the world that it means here. The world is changing, and we need to understand that. We also talked about sexual morality. And again, we're losing ground here. More children every day are born out of wedlock. We have a general acceptance, and even today a celebration of practices like homosexuality. We have, I read about this, prostitution garages in Switzerland. This is not easy to talk about, but the government of Switzerland is actually building garages so that prostitutes can ply their trade in a comfortable, safe space. So you can just drive the car into this garage. That's what they're made for. In San Francisco, there's now mobile bedrooms. If you're out on the town and you want to commit some sexual act that is inconsistent with God's law, they will deliver a mobile bedroom to you. It's pulled on a truck. Can you believe that? We're losing ground in sexual morality. We've talked about the status of women. Today we have the rise of Islam and other areas, other things in the world. I don't want to put it all on Islam, but Islam's a big part of it, where women are viewed as property in many parts of the world. They have few or no political rights. They are deprived of education opportunities, and they are frequently the subjects of abuse. In Boko Haram, remember all those ladies that were taken into captivity in Nigeria? Women are under attack today. And we live in a world today where liberty and justice is under attack. Today we have an increasing reliance on group rights and group identity. It matters more what group you're in than it does what you do, matters more than what you do as an individual. We have a de-emphasis of individual responsibility. It's more the government that's supposed to take care of you, and we have the rise of non-democratic governments. We can see that in our papers. So what can we do? We look around us and we have got storm clouds that are gathering all around us. What can we do about that? Does Christianity still make a difference today? Is there something that you and I can do to combat what we see coming in? Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13. Jesus says, "Ye are the salt of the earth. But if the salt hath lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill that cannot be hid. Whether neither do man light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." You know, light's an interesting thing. We've got a lot of light here today. We've got windows all around. If I held up a flashlight and I kind of pointed it around the room, you probably wouldn't be able to even see the beam because we've got so much light in here. But you know, if we could block out all these windows and we could turn the lights off, we could make this place pitch dark, and I turned on a light, you know what you'd be able to do? You'd see it. Let me tell you something. It's getting dark out there. Our light needs to shine. And as it gets darker, that light becomes more important. That light becomes more pronounced. And Christianity can have an impact today again. In short, through persistence and appropriate Christian influence, we need to spread God's word, and by doing so, we need to do what the Christians did in the first century. We need to turn the world upside down. It is time for us to look at areas like the sanctity of life and to say, you know what? Murder is wrong, period. It's just wrong, and no amount of convenience, no amount of profit, or any other explanation or excuse or rationalization can change that. We need to be a city on a hill when it comes to sexual morality. We need to say that marriage is honorable and that the bed is undefiled and that sexual perversions that we find out there are not only wrong in the Bible, they are disgraceful and harmful to the individual. We need to be salt that has not lost its savor when it comes to women. Why should we concede so much to Islam, who can't even treat women civilly, much less honor them, when we serve a God and we are members of a religion that not only treats women civilly, but we honor women, we reverence women, we value their contribution in the church? Why would we do that? We need to start speaking out about the impact that Christianity can have. And we need to be a light that cannot be hid when it comes to law and justice. We need to stand up and say, you know what, individual rights matter. And it doesn't matter what group you're a part of. You need to take responsibility for your life. God taught that, and you need to make the right decision about Christ. It is time for us to be that light, to start making a difference. Christianity does make a difference. It had a difference before. It will have a difference again if only you and I will stand up for God, stand up for His message, and turn the world upside down once again. God bless you, and thank you very much.